Welcome back to another episode on The Wrong Idea. In case you're unfamiliar, being wrong is about embracing subjective experience over objective truth. We're not interested in being correct, we just want to explore our own insights and opinions. I'm Jack, dicing it up with my brother Lucas. What are we going into this week?
Well, you expressed some interest in this notion of perception. And I think the context was that for a good chunk of my childhood, was very into magic tricks, performing magic tricks. So I have a lot of thoughts around sort of the way we can trick the mind and the way that we think about the world that we see and what is actually there versus what we believe is there.
Indeed, I did express some interest about this because in one of our previous episodes, I had expressed a strong belief that the mind cannot be fooled or tricked. And I made a very strong argument about this because I feel that sort of whatever you see in the world around you is really just what is. So to me, it's interesting because when I think of watching magicians, even you from like my early childhood doing card tricks and stuff that would just blow my mind was very well being tricked. So to me, it's interesting that what you sort of focus on, because you're focused on all of these big movements and the act that the magician is putting on, there's all of this stuff going on behind the scenes that you never really notice until it is, well, you either can figure it out, it's revealed to you, or you never know because the trick is over. It's just it, perked up a lot of things in my mind. So the first thing I want to ask you is, do you remember what initially got you into doing magic?
You know, I can't put my finger on something specific, but I think if I'm being as objective as I can looking back on all the things that I've done, I feel like a common thread is this notion of mystery and problem solving. And I think that what I liked about magic was the fact that you could appear to do things that were impossible and to create the illusion of these things happening that were not explainable. I always liked, learning the explanation, learning what was going on, why it was happening, or like how it was happening. But at the same time, I think for me as the mechanic doing the magic, that's what's interesting, but it's not why I like to do it for people. I like to give that sense of wonder, to give that moment where you don't actually have an answer to something because there's something that is so, I don't know, like satisfying in that it's unsatisfying. It's like you want to know and you know that it shouldn't be possible and yet it was possible. And so that contradiction, I don't know. I feel like there's not a lot of moments like that we can just create for people. Like you sometimes have those moments randomly, but to be able to pull one off on the fly is kind of a fun skill to have. So I think it really is this notion of how we see the world and wanting to understand it and then being able to force you not to, which is sort of this whole thing that I like of mystery of like I wish that I understood. I want to know what's out there, but sometimes we can't always know.
My boiled down version of that is it just seems like it was the perfect concoction of a whole bunch of things that you took interest in, mashed into one, creating this like magical potion of a thing. Because, I think that because you have such an interest in the why behind things, it's probably one of the reasons why you took to math, because you can very much so have a basic understanding of math on the surface, but there's always a whole lot behind what's going on. There's a lot of proofs. You can do a lot of different ways to get to a solution. So that's just the way my mind abstracts that. And then you also mentioned the word mystery, and there's a lot of mysteries in the world of math too. Still, I'm going to relate a lot of these back to math, but one of the things that we were talking about before we hit the record button was the notion of infinity. That was a whole spiel. And then unsatisfaction, which I think is also interesting. You mentioned the fact that sort of forcing people to be comfortable with being uncomfortable is an interesting notion. And I think that all of these things together tie into, I think, even as someone who knows a little bit about how to do a couple of very, very basic tricks that I think anybody could learn, is so interesting to it. It's a very, like you said, it's an abstract art. It's something that is sort of unique to do. it's one thing that I've always just had in my mind been like, how in the world do people think to create these tricks is something which has always blown me away. It's this idea that you can think of something to trick someone else. Thinking of ways to trick people is hard enough in and of itself, but then doing it on these grand and massive scales is just crazy. And then one of the reasons that I wanted to dig into this episode with you is because I think there's a lot of parallels with this, which you could dive into and carry over into other like walks and fields of life. In general, there's probably a lot of lies which you get told. There's a lot of illusions which are put up for you to change the way you see things or the way you believe things. So if you had to, pick out one of these, say, parallels, what's one that sticks out to you?
Okay, before we go there, I'm going to take a second to respond to some of what you were saying because there's a lot there and it's worth digging into a bit more. It's funny that you mentioned the connections. I think characterizing it as like a lot of the things that I was interested in all mashed together. I'm not sure. Maybe there's something there, and I will come back to that in a minute. But one of the things that I've always said when asked about sort of parallels between the things that I'm interested in, I think that magicians and engineers are actually often very similar in the ways that they think about the world, except the fundamental difference. Well, let me say this. They're similar, they think similarly about the world in that they're always trying to create something that has not yet existed. And in, if you're a magician, you're trying to come up with your own tricks. I mean, oftentimes obviously you'll be able to use tricks that other people have created and that you can simply perform yourself. But I think the creative art of magic is the stuff that I find the most interesting, inventing new tricks and or new presentations of tricks. And I guess that's a whole thing to get into as well. But that creative act is very similar in my mind to engineering, except in the core difference again here is the magician, well, let's start. The engineer invents something and he wants you to know exactly how it works. The magician invents something and he doesn't want you to know at all how it works.
That's an interesting distinction. I've never thought about this before, but it makes a lot of sense logically. I mean, it's just sort of, that the extra level of abstraction to me is just, I guess the whole point is that it should be blurry to those who haven't taken time to understand it, and it's incredibly blurry. And it's super interesting to think about this now because you're very right. A whole lot of magic is this engineering in a sense, literally, of a trick which is, you're trying to get some desired outcome or whatever. Maybe if you even look at someone like David Blaine, there's a lot of engineering and science that goes into doing his magic tricks. Yet he has to add that level of mystery and gray area over what he does. So I think that recognizing that parallel is also interesting because you do engineering in the software realm, which is to me still more in that like theoretical and not so much physical yet realm. And it's interesting because the parallels are still very apparent. There's so many different things that I could dig into with that though.
Yeah, well, I mean, I also studied engineering physics, a variety of disciplines in engineering. So I've seen sort of the common threads of how engineers solve problems. And again, I do liken it to that same process in magic. And in particular, like you bring up some of the grander scale illusions. Like I would even point to like David Copperfield, where you have these grand stage illusions that are like massive things that actually do need to be legitimately engineered. And there are people who work on as engineers on magic tricks. So there is definitely overlap there. But I even think that even in the smaller scale tricks, there's a lot of design and work that goes into it. I do think that that's sort of the part that people don't see is like, yes, there's a lot that goes into creating these experiences for people. Oftentimes, if we do our jobs right, it should appear as a spontaneous event. It should appear as more of a natural, free form, not pre planned at all sort of situation. But oftentimes, in order to make that seemingly spontaneous moment happen, you had to engineer quite a bit to make that moment even possible. So I think that is sort of the pulling the strings behind the scenes and trying to distract people from seeing the big picture. Because you bring up, a while ago, you brought up this notion of larger movements disguising smaller movements. That's certainly a big principle that comes up in Magic all the time. But I think it's even more than that. Is we want to create sort of this false reality, and we want you to end up believing our false reality. And so this now is a good way to segue to what you were talking about just a minute ago, the question you asked about what are some parallels. Well, I think that there's a lot in the world where people try to create a false reality that they want you to believe. And this can lead to a lot of manipulation, or it can lead to, well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that anything can be used for good and for bad. Influence and manipulation are two sides of the same coin. So you want to be able to influence people because sometimes you can influence them to do good things, great things. But sometimes you can, if you're on the manipulation side, you're trying to get someone to do something not for their benefit but for yours. And I think this shows up everywhere in the world in terms of the realities that even general news media want us to believe. They have some message that they want us to accept as the truth, as what is real. But a lot of these narratives are just that. They're false realities that are being shown to us with the intent of getting us to buy into that illusion. So being able to see through that, maybe that's a big part of why I was drawn to these things, because I don't, even if I enjoy that process, like understanding how it works and being able to use it myself if necessary, to be able to do the magic, not to just see the magic done and be put into these false realities. I want to be able to distinguish when someone is trying to create a world for me that doesn't actually exist.
It's the magic behind the magic is like the way that I like thought about it, because creating that false reality in and of itself is kind of magic, which is kind of interesting. There's the magic which you see, and then there's the magic which you don't see. Yet both of them are reality just the same. And I think that's probably one of the really interesting things. But you talked a lot about this notion of illusion, and it's one of the big reasons that I was so interested in this topic, because I think that illusion in itself is a very interesting thing. Because I think that, like you said, anything can be used for good or bad, depending upon which side of the coin you fall on. And I think that it's interesting the ways that people can use illusions to trick themselves into doing things. Maybe you try and trick yourself into the illusion of, I think the easiest example that I could fall back on is boxers, fighters in specific, have to lean back a lot on this. I think maybe even like this delusional version of themselves that they have of oh, I'm this great fighter that can go into this ring, because you can't have fear walking into a ring if you're going to go and put your life on the line. They have to sort of create this false reality in which they are a god in a sense. They are this person that nobody can touch and nobody can contend, and creating that reality for yourself, it can be empowering, and it can make you dangerous. It can make you a weapon. It can make you something that nobody else wants to mess with. But then again, like you said, there's also the flip side. It could make you dangerous in a bad way. It could start making you do things which are detrimental to yourself or detrimental to other people around you. And I think it's interesting that it's such a simple change. It's just the way that you look at it that changes how it's used. Like in a sense of, if you can look at a magic trick for the, like from like a normal person's eye, you're going to be tricked by it. But if you look at it from the eyes of a person who is engineer the trick or the magician performing it, you know exactly what's going on, exactly when the trick is happening.
So there's this notion of perspective that you're bringing up, which I think is important and I want to touch on. But the first things first, when you said the magic behind the magic, this isn't quite what you're talking about, but what it reminded me of is there's also this level of magic that is sort of fun where magicians will try to fool each other. And this is sort of the ultimate thing where it's like, it's really fun to try to do something for a magician and have them not know what you did, we sort of love that, because if you can do that for us, it's like, again, when you know a lot of the Magic landscape, and you know how a lot of stuff is done, you're not going to get fooled by a lot of stuff. So that's why, that whole show with Penn and Teller doing the fool us thing, like, I get exactly where they're coming from, and it's such a fun way to present magic. But I guess where I was going with this is the magic behind the magic. Sometimes magicians will do tricks and they won't appear necessarily as impressive to a lay audience, but to magicians, because we know how you did it, and because we know how hard it was to do what you just did, or how interesting or clever what you just did was, that in itself is impressive to us. It's like, the it doesn't matter what the result was, the fact that you even pulled that off is incredible. It's stuff like that. So something a magician might appreciate a trick on a different level than the average person, because they know what's going on. So there is that as well. But I want to come back to what you were talking about, because something bothered me about the way you were framing things, in terms of, I don't think that individuals need to create a false reality for themselves. So I want to focus in on this, because there's sort of reality, the world, the external world that we live in, and then there's sort of our mentality, the internal world that we create. And there's I struggle with this notion of false, because you can kind of create whatever you want in your mind, and it's just as real as anything else. It's just that it doesn't manifest in the physical world. It's a subjective manifestation, not an objective manifestation. So I would argue that it's a lot more akin to a self hypnosis than it is to creating an illusion, because I don't think it's an illusion. I think it is reality.
That's interesting because it was probably a semantic thing on my side because I do agree with you. I think that you're tricking your mind, sort of creating this stage in your head which changes the way that your view or perception of reality in and of itself manifests, right? So I think that we end up in the same place if I'm understanding this correctly, because to me it's sort of this idea that you can frame things in your mind the way that you want to frame them. And because you frame things in a certain way, you're going to look at them a certain way, you're going to experience them a certain way, you're going to be looking for certain things, and you're going to learn certain lessons differently. So, in my head, it's sort of just a way that you change the way that the reality which you experience manifests itself to you. And I think that the reason I use the term false reality is because maybe you are choosing to ignore certain aspects of it and take a more focused or fixated view on something. You know, I'm going to take the view of a racing driver. If you're going to sort of try and create this false reality of, okay, I'm on a track with 19 other drivers, but I have 3 seconds to the dude behind me and 5 seconds to the person in front of me. So I can't see anybody else. So in my mind, they don't exist. I'm just going to be here. I'm going to do my stint. I'm going to get all of my laps done. I'm not going to make a mistake so that whenever anybody else has to pit or I've done my thing, I've done my job. I don't have a problem to worry about. So to me, the what I would say in my head is quote unquote a false reality is I'm all alone on this track. There's nobody else here because I can't see anybody else. But what's really going on is you've got, you know, 2, 3 guys behind you fighting for that position who want to come and catch you, and the dude 5 seconds in front of you is worried about you catching him. But all you're focused on is the fact that you're all alone and you can't see anybody. You see where I'm sort of getting at with that idea?
Yeah, I do. I again, like, immediately, what I pick up on is that you start with this notion of tricking your mind, and so I like, this is definitely the crux of where I'm picking, and I don't necessarily think that it's a question of either or here. But the way that I think about things is that it's not necessarily tricking my mind. Like, maybe maybe this is sort of the idealist as opposed to materialist point of view that I tend to come from, which is much more this notion that my mind can impact the world. And so, by believing something in this moment, it's not that I'm trying to, like, I don't this in other words, the outside world has nothing to do with it for me. I'm not worried about trying to create a false reality of where I am. And I know what you're talking about. I get the idea of, like, I'm going to filter out only the I'm going to filter out the irrelevant details and focus in on what matters. That's great, and that all makes sense to me. But my perspective on it is that it starts with just the belief in yourself and the desire to do whatever it takes to get the job done in that moment. And then, however, it is that you need to configure your mind to be in that zone, that's great. And sure, maybe you could call that a false reality. I think that we're talking about the same thing, and we're talking about it in two different ways. And so that part is the part I understand of what you're saying. And it's just for me that I think what happens is that we're not tricking our mind, we're actually creating reality, like first from our own imagination, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And this isn't a notion that I've come across myself and is quite interesting. It's that, you never are going to know what happens in somebody else's reality or what happens in an objective reality. Like what even is an objective reality? What goes on? Like if five people are standing in a room turned around, but someone's jumping behind them and nobody knows that someone's jumping behind them, did it really happen? Was it a thing? If there's no cameras, if nobody even saw it or heard it, they all have headphones on, they don't know what happens. How does anyone know that it even happens? Just throwing out a complete perfect hypothetical there that would be totally weird. But it's interesting because I think that thinking about the fact that maybe you can create reality around you or you sort of exist in the reality around you is interesting because you and me abstract it in two different ways yet end up in the same place, which again I think is really cool to see because we have similar philosophical bases. I've said this before, but we abstract things in different ways but end up in the same place. I always think it's super dope, but that's besides the point. I think that coming at it from either angle is fine because like you said, it's important that you can end up in the right place for whatever your mind needs. And again, I think I'm going to root this sort of back to my whole thing about you need to know yourself. However you can get yourself to the place where you need to be to get the job done is what's really important. And knowing how to do that is a process of like accepting yourself and all of this. But what I really want to sort of go into is, how do you think that being a magician for a point in time in your life has helped you with this process of sort of abstracting or creating the reality around you, knowing what you do about how magic tricks are done and the parallels that the magic world and the like real everyday world sort of have with each other?
I think the best way to answer your question is just again in terms of understanding that we can create the illusion of anything we want in the right circumstances. We can get people to believe things that aren't necessarily true. Like knowing that that is a thing that is possible to do and knowing some of the techniques involved in making that happen is just empowering in the sense that you feel like you can't be fooled as easily. You know what's in the bag of tricks. You know what things people might do to try to persuade you or manipulate you or control your sense of reality. And so being able to just think for myself, to try to understand what it would take to create the illusion of this, to always question, is what I'm seeing really what's there? Because I kind of still know what you mean when you say your mind can't be fooled, but something about that phrase to me just doesn't sit right because in so many ways to me, I think your mind can absolutely be fooled, and being able to recognize that it can and what might be fooling it, I think is the key to the question you just asked me. Is like, what has it done for me? It's made that part of my mind far more honed and just aware of what's going on.
This is interesting. You've actually made me have to maybe go back and rethink this because you said that maybe the key is that understanding that your mind can be fooled is the key to working around that whole sort of can it be tricked, can it not be tricked, which is really interesting. And I'm probably gonna go sit up for another 2 hours after we stop recording and think about this. So that's gonna be interesting. But I think it's an interesting notion of itself. My initial thoughts just coming after this, because this is sort of a new way for me to come at things, is maybe you're right. Maybe so. It would make a lot of sense that recognizing a fault in and of yourself can help you to conquer it, work around it, and use it to your advantage in a sense, turning a weakness into a strength, or just, realizing that while it's a weakness for some things, it may be a strength for other things, all of those things. But I'm definitely gonna have to go back to that.
Well, let me make it even worse on you. So I come back to engineering. And the core skill again, and I think that this is the parallel to magic becomes very clear when I frame it this way. But the idea is we're building a model of the world. And that model is necessarily an approximation of the world. If we could actually create the world, then it would be the world and it wouldn't be a model of the world. So whenever we're doing something for the purposes of our attention is focused on this problem, we need to create a model of the world that is sufficiently robust that it can reproduce what we would expect to see in this scenario. And then in the case of magic, for example, we need to be able to convince you that sort of the normal rules apply, and then we need to break them in some unexpected way. And in engineering, we're building a model and we're saying, okay, these are the expected results, and we're going to use those to derive some value that is needed. So we're going to actually apply those rules as we've specified them to create the result that is expected. So expected versus unexpected, I think, is really where that big shift is in terms of what the intent of the models are in the two different paradigms. But the reason I come back to this is, again, it's all approximations. And so when you talk about these things, what comes to mind for me is even just the limitations of what we can see. Yeah, we can see a lot, but there's a whole electromagnetic spectrum and we can only see some tiny sliver of it. There are a huge range of temperatures that exist in the universe, but we only ever experience a variance of tens of degrees. So it's not like we actually are experiencing the true reality of the world. We can only hear so many frequencies. Like, there is more out there than we can experience. We're only modeling it. It's our perception of the world. And so inherently, I think that, like, I guess that's what it is for me, is like, you say the mind can't be fooled, and I'm in my head I go, but the mind is like literally constantly being fooled. That's like all that's happening. Like, we're literally just in a perpetual state of being fooled at all times. And the illusion of reality, the fact that it's even consistent and coherent, is kind of amazing in and of itself. Yeah, I think where I'm coming from is, my stance is that I'm always susceptible to being fooled. And so I need to be alert and conscious and aware of what's going on and how I might be fooled in order to act in my best interest in the real world, using my approximations of it.
Well, my brain has gone kablooey again. I appreciate it when you do this, because now I'm gonna have there's gonna be a whole new chapter of my brain that's gonna open up and is gonna have to think about this. So this is why I love doing this so much, because I now have a whole new perspective, which we even tapped into, having a perspective look at things from in this episode, to try and think about stuff from. So much appreciated for that. I'm gonna have a blast watching this back, and just knowing that I was sitting here in my chair making hilarious facial expressions. And
ladies and gentlemen, for my next trick, I will make us disappear.
Oh, tremendous. Alrighty. So if you guys want to have your mind tricked, you can find more content just like this on Instagram, TikTok, and X before next week's episode. Until then, keep finding more wrong ideas.
Got a thought that challenges the norm? We want to hear it. Post your wrong idea with the hashtag #WrongIdea. That's RONG idea. And join the conversation. Who knows? Your perspective might just be featured in a future episode. Remember, in a world of endless perspectives, all ideas are wrong ideas. Until next time, keep thinking, keep challenging, and keep embracing the unconventional.